This is the India moment. The India growth story is making big headlines across the globe. Every institution, every rating agency, every brokerage has recognized how India is growing at a pace which stands out from the rest of the world. Now, the latest one is from S&P Global. S&P Global very clearly in a special report has said that India will grow at the rate of 6.7% for the next 6 to 7 years, which could double our GDP to almost $6.7 trillion and take our per capita income to $4,500. Now, who better to join in this conversation than Deepa Kumar, Head of Asia Pacific Country Risk, S&P Global Market Intelligence. Deepa, welcome to BQ Prime.
Thank you, Murli. Thank you for having me here.
Okay, Deepa, so the reason, as we have been saying, is that your article, as part of this 67-page report, has a special mention about the key grassroots requirements to achieve this kind of a growth. Before I go to specifics, could you give a synopsis of what the core idea that you have laid out in the article?
Thank you, Murli. Just to speak of the journal at a large is like you said at the beginning, this is India's moment. So the different pieces of the journal are what we identify as trying to encapsulate what this moment means for India's future. All the articles look out to 2030, including mine. They're not a comment on the current state of play, but they're looking out to the future. Tying back to my article, which is on the center state dynamics, one of the reasons we chose to do that is because we're saying that alignment, even if not always agreement, is going to be important for the central government, the different state governments, and the increasingly important, what I identify, the city level governments, to tackle the many challenges and to reach the potential that we're identifying for India. This is important because if they don't do that, it kind of results in a situation where you could be having a growth scenario which is a little hindered. You could be having a reform scenario which can move back and forth, or you could be having a kind of development situation which is uneven or more focused in one part of India as opposed to another part of India. Having said that, what we identify in the report as a given is that there is a big India picture which all states, the central government, all lower levels of government, be it at the village level, at the city level, are in tune with. So we're not worried about the big picture getting missed by any of them, but increasing coordination is important. But what will be inevitable also is the competition between the center and the states and between state governments themselves.
Right. Okay. So let me come down to the specific. The key driver for us over I think the last 5-6 years have been services. Now, to achieve this kind of sustained growth to double the size of the economy over a period of 6 to 7 years, I think manufacturing has to come in, So the role of manufacturing is still not, I think, sufficient enough. What are your thoughts on the manufacturing role?
Yes, absolutely. It's something we identify in the report. One of the things we did is we drew a loose comparison between India today and the East Asian tigers, as they were called a couple of decades ago and when they were growing. What is different is India is a very domestically oriented economy and, as you said, services oriented. So we have to acknowledge that the growth trajectories are going to be different. So it's not a case of services or manufacturing. It's going to be a case of services and manufacturing. Services is already contributing about 53-54% of India's GDP today, whereas manufacturing is right now still at about 18%, with the government setting a target of about 25% in the next, say, few years. It's not going to be a case where manufacturing overshadows services or suddenly we become a manufacturing dominant economy instead of services. They will both grow hand in hand and both will be important to the India story, which, like I was saying, is different from the East Asian story because at that time, even global headwinds were fewer. Globalization as a broad term was the mood of the season. It's not, there are challenges to that today. So we'll have to see for India how it plays out in this current global environment, but they'll have to leverage that domestic economy and that domestic labor force, which means both will move parallel.
Okay, so I'll come to labor force in a bit, but there are many bottlenecks that are there in manufacturing at the grassroots level. I'm not talking about the overall policy and the intention of the government. At the grassroots level, I'm sure manufacturing is facing a number of bottlenecks. Have you identified them, and how do you think they can resolve, and why are they important here?
I'd bucket these into two kind of bottlenecks. One is the reform agenda, so to speak, but I'm not talking land acquisition and labor. I think we have a piece in the journal that specifically focuses on logistics. So what do you do if India becomes a mega manufacturing player or a bigger player in global supply chains if it doesn't have that logistics support to become an export oriented economy? So be it road connectivity, rail connectivity, freight corridors, and port capacity. I'd say at the absolute grassroots, what India needs first is that building up of logistics capacity, which means even if you do build up manufacturing and a quantity scale perspective, it can be exported outside. The other is the upskilling, and this is the quality game. So if the logistics bit was the quantity game, it's the quality game, which is upskilling. In one of the pieces in the report, we identified that real value added per employee in manufacturing is just about $8,000. That's significantly lower than what we're seeing in Southeast Asian economies like Malaysia and Thailand. So upskilling the labor force at an absolute grassroots level, so even the quality of Indian manufacturing improves. Those are going to be the two, I'd say, opportunities. They are not just bottlenecks, they are also the opportunities on which if these different state center governments that I identify in my piece start working together, it could help that manufacturing piece and becoming a bigger share in the Indian economy.
Right. Okay. So now that is at the grassroots level. At the macro level, we need to push the capital expenditure in a big way. If the manufacturing share has to go up, manufacturing has to have a sustained growth, because unless we put that capital, the big capital, I would say, things will not move forward. In bits and pieces, we can keep investing here and there. Now, do you see that we have a very clear, cohesive strategy to put capex in the economy?
I think there is acknowledgement of that capex piece, especially from private investment perspective. So one of the kind of policy pieces that we are focusing a lot on, and several pieces of the journal have talked about them, are the production linked incentive schemes. They are going to be very crucial to get that so far inconsistent private investment into the manufacturing sector in the coming decade. They're already, if I remember correctly, in 15 sectors so far with varying levels of success and varying level of uptake. But that kind of a policy focus, which directly targets increasing private investment, not just capital expenditure from the government or not just public sector expenditure, is going to be the variable alongside these other policies and reform agendas that I said. So yeah, we'll have to see how the production linked incentive schemes are expanded, how they are implemented, and what is the momentum to continue working with them for, say, about the next 5 to 7 years to come.
Okay, so your pet project or theme, let me shift focus to that one. The competition between states, we can see that competition. Everybody is hosting some kind of investment summit to attract investors. You can see, as in the case of trying to get Foxconn, whether it's Telangana or Karnataka or Maharashtra or Gujarat for that matter, everyone has been lining up, and to some extent Karnataka has made some kind of an MOU with them, got a commitment from Foxconn, but that's only a small example. In terms of states competing with each other, now that's a very challenging area. There cannot be cooperation. There seems to be only competition, partly because of the political requirement and the creation of jobs. What are your thoughts on this crucial aspect?
It's like you said, competition is inevitable. It's what we say in the piece as well, that we are more in a competitive federal environment than in a cooperative federal environment. Voters have started distinguishing between state elections and parliamentary elections quite sharply of late from what we've been assessing, which also makes state governments very acutely aware of what is it that they are offering at that absolute state level. When they come up for elections, every year there are major state elections in India. So we track even those, not just the parliamentary elections. And how is it that they are going back to voters and saying what is the success that they've achieved? What are the projects that they've sort of got under their belt in the last few years, and what is their report card looking like? So I'd definitely say that competition is the next mantra for the next few years. It's not necessarily a bad thing. What we have also been advising, or what we have also been speaking of to international governments and businesses who work with India, is that it's a question of acknowledging that states will compete with each other, that sometimes you might find better terms in one state as opposed to another state, you might find better resources and availability in one state than in another state, is something that you need to work with as a prerequisite for operating in India, as opposed to a post hoc consideration or something that comes in at a later point. So I'd say it's agnostic of even political parties, right? One of the things we hear a lot about is that if there is a political party alignment, it will help the situation. But we see competition irrespective of that. We've seen competition for a few years irrespective of that kind of dynamic. So yeah, I'd say it's one to watch for, it's one to work with, it's not one to ignore or one to put aside.
So when it comes to competition and offering incentives to, let's say, a big investor, whether the investor is domestic or a foreign player, the typical concessions or the incentives that a state government would give is land and some tax concessions, and promise of some infrastructure development. But in all this, one aspect is often ignored, which is the availability of skilled labor relevant to that particular industry. Now, this is a challenge. How do you view this challenge? How can this be tackled? Or will investors go where they get all three together?
I don't think it would be as simple as investors going where they get all three together. In some cases, the availability of resources like water, like land, is a lot more important than upskilled labor. But in some places, upskilled labor is more important than, say, the kind of other resources you get. Even political stability is one of the factors which impacts how investors make decisions, is which state has a more politically stable environment. So we assess all of these as a bucket and say that, it's some kind of a permutation of all three, depending on who the investor is, in what sector they are, what kind of natural resources are available. Labor specifically, we've been seeing that it's been taken up at the state level a lot more in the recent few months, in the recent, say, couple of years, than just a central government policy, which then gets trickled down to the state level. So even in terms of what is broadly known as labor reform in India, it's going to be a state-specific approach, which means that some states will have more kind of allowance for double shift working, for how they encourage women's participation, whereas some states might be weaker on that, but more on minimum wages support and other kind of insurance or other kind of audit support that they offer. It's going to be a disparate environment, so to speak. One size is not going to fit all when it comes to labor reform.
Right. Okay. Now, see, in fact, let me look at a chart that you have used here. There are some states that have been more successful at attracting FDI inflows, and you have put them in order of priority. I think Maharashtra is at the top historically, but for 2022-23, they've slipped a bit. That's followed by Karnataka and Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. Most of the top three states are featuring there. Now, which state is very conducive for attracting FDI in your assessment?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question. I wouldn't say there is ranking states in that kind of a reform platform agenda is something that we do or something that we did for this report. What I will say is that some of these decisions are not always only politicking. Like sometimes, we read a lot of commentariat which says that, some investment went to one state over the other because of the political situation or just the kind of government support that they found. But these are significant investor-led decisions. These are also commercial decisions. So however it is showing up, it's showing up because of a combination of these factors. It wouldn't be in absentia of reform. It cannot be in absentia of resources, and it cannot be in absentia of the kind of government support they'd find.
Right. So there is one more interesting chart that I picked up from this report, is the diverse growth trajectories of Indian states, which will encourage competitive federalism. And you have given projections for the current one, 2023, and going up to 2030. In this case, Maharashtra again tops the list. followed by Tamil Nadu, followed by Karnataka, and surprise, surprise, the fourth place is Uttar Pradesh. Why is that?
Yes, and the fifth is Gujarat.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a combination of factors which are already present in these states, how they attract jobs, what kind of reform agendas do they have, what kind of trajectories we expect them to be. I wouldn't say it's again a tell on the quality of reform agenda in any of the state versus the other. It's also just a case of the vastness with which these states have already been growing and the trajectories that they are on. I wouldn't, like I was saying, I wouldn't necessarily read them as a single point indicator of anything, but more in terms of a group of factors which are influencing how these states will grow. Maharashtra, for instance, has always been so much ahead of the race that growing at that kind of trajectory that we're seeing for Maharashtra is not surprising at all. In some cases, it's also linked very closely to that FDI chart, which is that, Gujarat's kind of FDI influence is increasing so much that it comes up as one of the top 5 states that would be growing in India to 2030 as per our projections.
Right. Okay. So my last question will be on what kind of risks do we see in this 6 to 7 year journey where we have to sustain at 6.7%. This is a macro question. If you can list out the risks, which may be out of fashion to talk at this stage, but then we cannot ignore the risks that will come in the way and how to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that report does exactly that, right? We're talking about the opportunities, but we're also absolutely talking about the steps that need to be taken to galvanize on this moment and to reach what we're saying India can reach by 2030. I would identify 2 risks, one which is domestic and one which is external. The domestic one, and which I think is really going to be a differentiator for India, is that demographic dividend question. It is one of our greatest strengths, which is that you have a labor force participation rate which is just waiting to grow. Less than 55% as per the report are actively employed. Among that, women, depending on a couple of different surveys that we looked at, are somewhere below 30%. So both increasing the role of women in active labor, upskilling, which then improves the overall quantity and quality of the labor force is absolutely crucial. That I'll say is the risk, and it's a boat that India shouldn't miss. The other is external. One of the big drivers of this report was the kind of geopolitical environment and geopolitical advantage that India right now finds itself in. There are major tailwinds to India becoming how it's defined in the report, going from being a balancing power to becoming a leading power. But that is also a window. That window depends on how India negotiates in multilateral institutions for its objectives, how India negotiates or builds on some of its key bilateral partnerships, be it the United States, be it countries in the Gulf, be it Japan, Australia, or other Asia-Pacific countries. This is a window of be it trade, investment, just kind of the trust dynamics that India shouldn't miss. So those 2 would be the risks and the opportunities that, depending on how India capitalizes on those, it will change the outlook for what we're seeing in the report.
Okay, so one last point, a comment from you. These are the latest headlines from the morning reports that we look at. Two extremes. One is the China has slipped into deflation at one end. At the other end, the US. At one level, we don't see fears of recession being visible, but the risks in the banking sector, like Moody's has cut the ratings of some 10 banks, and they're saying that we will cut some more for major lenders. Now, these 2 are very big risks for us. Let me leave Europe out. If these 2 risks are to be seen in the light of the current optimism that we have about India, where do we stand?
I mean, it's not my place to comment on reports that are released externally, but I think if India's focus is on what we're saying with those domestic macro pieces, what we've called ingredients for a decade of macro success, I think that should be India's focus, notwithstanding the external environment.
Okay, that's a very optimistic note, and the confidence stems from the fact that India can do this, and it's India's moment. Thank you so much, Deepa, for joining us and taking us through.
Thank you for having me, Murli.